Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: Ukraine latest, Russia says ship damaged in missile strike on Crimea port. U.S. officials outline steps to Israel to reduce civilian casualties. State, local police investigate homicide in Lewiston. Zelensky denies reports of pressure from partners for peace talks with Russia. Up to 400,000 people remain along Gaza front after Israel rejects pause. Ukraine latest, Russia says ship damaged in missile strike on Crimea port. Nikkei Asia. The war in Ukraine continues to escalate as both sides intensify attacks in contested regions. On November 5, a barrage of Ukrainian cruise missiles damaged a vessel at a Russian shipyard in the Crimean port city of Kerch. While it is unclear what kind of ship was hit, the Ukrainian Air Force commander expressed hope that another ship had been sunk, referring to the sinking of the Russian Black Sea Fleet flagship in April 2022. Russian forces are now focused on capturing the coking plant in the key eastern Ukrainian town of Avdiivka. The town's mayor warns that a new wave of attacks is expected to begin soon. Additionally, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has appointed a new commander of its special forces, though no explanation was given for the change. Moldova has banned a pro-Russia party from taking part in local elections, citing national security concerns. Turkey and France are increasing engagement with Central Asia, as Russia's influence in the region wanes. The Turkey-led Organization of Turkic States held its 10th summit, calling for broader cooperation among its member countries. The U.S. has announced its 50th tranche of military equipment to Ukraine since August 2021, including air defense capabilities and anti-tank weapons. The U.S. has committed over $44.8 billion in security assistance to Ukraine since Russia's invasion in February 2022. The U.S. has also announced sweeping sanctions against Russia, targeting energy and mining, sanctions evasion, and the production of attack drones. Russian President Vladimir Putin has blamed the U.S. for the conflict in the Middle East, accusing it of wanting constant chaos in the region. U.S. officials outline steps to Israel to reduce civilian casualties. New York Times. U.S. officials have privately outlined steps to Israel to reduce civilian casualties in its military campaign in the Gaza Strip, including using smaller bombs, when targeting Hamas leaders and infrastructure. Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken said Friday during a visit to Israel that he had spoken to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about concrete steps that the United States believes Israel could and should take to minimize civilian deaths. The Secretary of State did not specify in his remarks what those concrete steps entailed. But U.S. officials, who spoke on the condition of anonymity because the meetings were private, said there have been a number of conversations in which they have advised their Israeli counterparts to take a more deliberate approach in their operations. They told the Israelis that they could reduce civilian casualties if they improved how they targeted Hamas leaders, gathered more intelligence on Hamas command and control networks before launching strikes, used smaller bombs to collapse the tunnel network, and employed their ground forces to separate civilian population centers from where the militants are concentrated. State, local police investigate homicide in Lewiston. Yahoo! State and local police in Lewiston, Maine are investigating a death that was reported on Friday evening. The death is being treated as a homicide, and an autopsy will be performed to gather more information. No further details about the incident, including the location, have been released at this time. Zelensky denies reports of pressure from partners for peace talks with Russia. Yahoo! Ukraine's President Zelensky has said that he is under no pressure from his international partners, including the EU and US, to open peace negotiations with Russia. Zelensky stated that he will not sit down with Russia and give them something. The comments came after reports that US and European officials had privately discussed the possibility of peace talks with Russia. The Biden administration is concerned that Ukraine is running out of forces while Russia has seemingly endless supplies, and officials have privately described the situation on the front lines in Ukraine as a stalemate. Up to 400,000 people remain along Gaza front after Israel rejects pause. Washington Post. As many as 400,000 people are still in northern Gaza despite heavy bombardment and warnings from Israel to evacuate. An additional 800,000 to 1 million residents have fled to southern areas of Gaza. The Gaza Health Ministry has estimated that 2,200 people, including 1,250 children, are buried under rubble. Overall, over 9,400 people have been killed, many of them women and children. The Biden administration is urging Israel to allow brief humanitarian pauses in the fighting, to allow aid in and people out, and to expand the amount of supplies flowing into Gaza. However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected a temporary ceasefire, stating that it should not include the return of hostages. At a meeting in Amman, Jordan, U.S. and Arab leaders clashed over whether Israel should halt its offensive in Gaza, with regional leaders accusing Israel of crossing the line from self-defense into war crimes. Secretary of State Antony Blinken defended Israel, stating that it needed to eliminate Hamas as a security threat. Protest marches from U.S. to Berlin call for immediate halt to Israeli bombing of Gaza. The Toronto Star. Tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian demonstrators marched in various cities across the world yesterday, calling for an end to Israel's bombardment of Gaza. The protesters, particularly in countries with large Muslim populations, expressed disillusionment with their governments for supporting Israel. In the U.S., thousands of protesters marched in Washington, D.C. to call for an end to the Israeli military campaign in Gaza, criticizing President Biden for his support of Israel. In France, several thousand protesters called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and shouted, "Israel, assassin." In Germany, around 6,000 protesters marched through Berlin, and several thousand marched in Dusseldorf. In Italy, there were large protests in Milan and Rome. In the UK, the Metropolitan Police made 11 arrests at a London protest, including one on a terrorism charge for displaying a placard that could incite hatred. 2 women who attended a pro-Palestinian march 3 weeks ago were charged under the UK's Terrorism Act for displaying images on their clothing of paragliders. Hamas employed paragliders in its October 7 surprise attack on Israel. Thousands protest genocide at D.C. rally for Palestine. The Independent. Thousands of protesters gathered in Washington, D.C. on Saturday to demonstrate against Israel's military campaign in Gaza. The protesters, who centered their efforts on Freedom Plaza, called for an end to the bloodshed and expressed their support for the Palestinian cause. The size of the crowd was difficult to estimate, but it was believed to number in the tens of thousands at least. The protesters included representatives from various Muslim American and pro-Palestine groups. Many of the signs and speeches at the event criticized Israel's actions in Gaza and accused the U.S. of complicity. The protesters also expressed their anger at President Joe Biden and his administration for their support of Israel. The demonstration is seen as part of a growing backlash against the Israeli military campaign and may put pressure on the Biden administration to call for a ceasefire. Pro-Palestine activists have been flooding the offices of Democratic lawmakers with calls and emails demanding a ceasefire, and some lawmakers have already expressed support for the idea. Protesters march in major cities to demand Gaza ceasefire. Reuters. Pro-Palestinian demonstrators held protests in cities around the world to call for a ceasefire in Gaza and criticize Israel's military actions against Hamas. Thousands of protesters marched in London, Berlin, Paris, Ankara, Istanbul, and Washington, D.C., demanding an end to the violence. The protests also criticized the support of U.S. President Joe Biden for Israel and called for action from civil rights leaders. Gaza health officials have reported that over 9,488 Palestinians have been killed in the Israeli assault. 1 year out, an unsettled country marks time for a 2024 showdown. Washington Post. As the 2024 election in the U.S. looms, the 2023 political landscape has yet to provide many clues about the road ahead. Key events throughout this year that might have impacted the political landscape have failed to do so. Donald Trump has been indicted 4 times in 4 jurisdictions and faces trials involving 91 felony counts, a first for a former president. House Republicans elected Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican California, as Speaker, then removed him after 9 months, and eventually replaced him with Representative Mike Johnson, Republican Louisiana. A mass killing in Maine has left 18 dead. Internationally, Hamas terrorists' attacks on Israeli citizens led to a new war in the Middle East and thousands of civilian casualties among Palestinians. Ukraine's war to repel the Russian invasion has been ongoing throughout the year. Despite these significant events, the contours of the 2024 presidential election remain largely unchanged. President Biden's approval ratings have barely moved, and the chance of a rematch between Biden and Trump remains the most likely scenario. Blinken resisting ceasefire as thousands attend D.C. pro-Palestine event. The Independent. Thousands of people gathered in Washington, D.C. on Saturday to call for a ceasefire in the conflict between Israel and Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is currently on a trip to the Middle East to meet with leaders in the region and discuss the situation. Blinken has reiterated his call for humanitarian pauses, but has said that the Biden administration is not in favor of an immediate ceasefire. The Israeli government has stated that it will not agree to a ceasefire unless Hamas releases all of the hostages it holds. The leaders of Egypt and Jordan criticized Israel's counteroffensive following their meetings with Blinken. Meanwhile, Hamas is reported to be blocking foreign nationals from leaving Gaza until it receives guarantees from Israel that ambulances can reach the border with Egypt. The UN Secretary-General and several countries have called for a ceasefire and the release of hostages. Pro-Palestinian protests have taken place around the world, including in London and Washington, D.C. The Nikki Haley-Ron DeSantis feud will play out in real time on next week's debate stage. CNN. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, who are both exploring a run for president in 2024, will face off in a primary debate in Miami next week. The two Republicans have been previewing their attacks lines against each other in interviews, stump speeches and ads. DeSantis has accused Haley of wanting to roll out the red carpet for China as governor in an effort to undercut her foreign policy credentials, while Haley has called DeSantis' attacks the desperate acts of a stalling campaign. The third debate is seen as a crucial moment in the race, as the Republican field has started to narrow and fewer candidates are expected on the debate stage. A poll in Iowa showed Haley with 16% support, up 10 percentage points from August and tied with DeSantis for second. DeSantis allies, however, argue he is the most popular second choice for both Trump and Haley supporters. DeSantis groups attacks Haley with facts but offers false conclusions. Washington Post. A political action committee, PAC, supporting Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has released an attack ad against former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, a rival for the Republican presidential nomination in 2024. The ad claims that Haley allowed a Chinese company, China Juicer, to set up a manufacturing plant near a U.S. military base and is therefore too dangerous to lead. However, the ad's claims have been criticized as misleading. While Haley has expressed concerns about Chinese investment in the U.S., she also helped to attract Chinese companies to her state during her tenure as governor. In 2016, China Juicer announced plans to establish a manufacturing plant in South Carolina, a move hailed as a huge win by Haley at the time. The ad claims that the factory is dangerously close to Fort Jackson, a U.S. Army training base, and that China Juicer is a communist company that supplies materials to the Chinese military. However, the ad does not provide any evidence to suggest that the factory is involved in espionage or poses a national security risk. The factory is not close enough to Fort Jackson to warrant additional government scrutiny if Fort Jackson were on a list of sensitive facilities, which it is not. New vehicles from Detroit's automakers are planned in contracts that ended UAW strikes. Associated Press. The United Auto Workers, UAW, union has ended a 6-week strike by securing a commitment from Detroit's automakers to build new electric vehicles, EVs, at several U.S. factories. The UAW said the expansion of EV production would preserve jobs and could create new ones, depending on how fast the nation transitions from gas engines to batteries. Stellantis plans to build a new midsize pickup in Belvidere, Illinois, and battery-run versions of 6 Jeep, Ram, and Dodge vehicles, while Ford will add at least 3 new electric vehicles, including a truck, and General Motors plans to build at least 6 EVs. Phoenix finishes clearing downtown homeless encampment after finding shelter for more than 500. Associated Press. The city of Phoenix has successfully cleared out a massive downtown homeless encampment by Saturday's court-ordered deadline by helping more than 500 people find beds in shelters and motels. Bowman calls for a clear distinction between Israeli citizens, government. Hill. Representative Jamal Bowman, Democrat, New York, has emphasized the need to distinguish between the Israeli government and the Jewish people, stating that criticizing the Israeli government does not equate to criticizing Jewish people. He argued that being anti-war in Gaza does not equate to anti-Semitism. Bowman and other progressive Democrats have criticized the Israeli government and called for a ceasefire in the conflict. Bowman also called on the Biden administration to hold Israel accountable for any violations of international law. The Biden administration has backed Israel in its conflict against Hamas, but has also called for a humanitarian pause in the war to assist Gaza civilians. Update 1 U.S. Africa Trade Program must be more than symbolic. U.S. Trade Chief. Yahoo! U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai has said the U.S. would like to see Africa's African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, be more than just a symbolic one, and more useful and effective. AGOA, which has been reauthorized twice before, is due to expire in September 2025, and talks are currently underway to update the duty-free initiative. Tai also said that the revised AGOA should aim to improve the program's utilization by qualifying countries and take into account the recent creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. U.S. Representative Tlaib accuses Biden of supporting genocide against Palestinians. Reuters. U.S. Representative Rashida Tlaib has accused President Joe Biden of supporting a genocide against Palestinians and warned of repercussions in the next election. Tlaib, the first Palestinian-American woman to serve in Congress, called for Biden to back a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict. She claimed that Biden supported the genocide of the Palestinian people and warned that the American people will remember his stance in the 2024 election. The White House has not yet responded to Tlaib's remarks. Special counsel asks judge to block cameras in Trump trial live. The Independent. A federal appeals court has temporarily lifted the gag order on former President Donald Trump in his 2020 election interference case. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit issued the ruling on Friday, pausing the limited gag order to allow judges more time to review Trump's request for a longer pause on the restrictions on his speech during his appeals. However, the court clarified that the temporary pause should not be seen as a ruling on the merits of Trump's request. The gag order was originally imposed by U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan and barred Trump from making public statements that targeted prosecutors, court staff, and potential witnesses in the case, accusing him of conspiring to overturn the 2020 election. The order still allows Trump to assert his innocence and claim that the case against him is politically motivated. The latest ruling from the appeals court sets oral arguments for November 20. The fraud trial, a civil proceeding, is one of 4 criminal indictments against Trump. The Trump Organization is accused of inflating asset values to obtain better financing terms from banks fraudulently. New York Attorney General Letitia James filed the case, and if successful, it could have severe consequences for the company. Meanwhile, Trump's children, including Eric Trump, have been testifying in the civil fraud trial. From Israel to India, illiberal U.S. allies are hurting its moral standing. South China Morning Post. U.S. President Joe Biden's handling of the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza has exposed the difficulties of his foreign policy approach. Biden has framed global politics as a struggle between democracies and autocracies, seeking to rally countries around democratic norms and values. However, his rhetoric has weakened democratic movements against illiberal allies and encouraged illiberalism. Biden has continued to support Israel and India, despite authoritarian trends and human rights concerns in both countries. This has led to accusations of hypocrisy and weakened the moral authority that Biden promised to strengthen. Republican defense hawks have had it with party populists. Bloomberg. Republican senators who support a strong U.S. military are challenging party populists over national security, increasing the odds for more Ukraine aid and an end to a months-long blockade on Pentagon promotions. The so-called defense hawks, who were once the power center of a party that has grown increasingly isolationist, have become more assertive amid a war in the Middle East, rising tensions between China and its neighbors, and a struggle over whether to continue assistance to Ukraine against Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your favorite resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, Dr. Six. Today, I bring you a mix of news from around the world, covering everything from the escalating war in Ukraine to the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza. But before we dive into the details, allow me to introduce myself. I am Dr. Six, your guide through the twists and turns of global events, here to provide you with witty, light-hearted, and humorous analysis. So let's get started. Starting off with Ukraine, tensions continue to rise as both sides ramp up their attacks. In a recent missile strike, a Ukrainian shipyard in the Crimean port city of Kerch was damaged. Ukrainian Air Force commander expressed hope that another ship had been sunk, referring to the sinking of the Russian Black Sea Fleet flagship. Meanwhile, Russian forces are focused on capturing a coking plant in eastern Ukraine, and the town's mayor warns of an impending wave of attacks. In other news, Moldova has banned a pro-Russia party from participating in local elections, citing national security concerns. Turkey and France are increasing their engagement with Central Asia, as Russia's influence wanes in the region. The US continues to support Ukraine, providing military equipment and imposing sweeping sanctions against Russia. Moving on to the Israel-Gaza conflict, US officials have privately outlined steps to Israel to reduce civilian casualties. Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken has called for concrete steps to minimize civilian deaths. However, Israel has rejected a temporary ceasefire, leading to protests around the world calling for an end to the Israeli military campaign. In domestic news, state and local police in Lewiston, Maine are investigating a homicide, and Ukraine's President Zelensky denies reports of pressure to open peace negotiations with Russia. Meanwhile, thousands of protesters gathered in Washington, D.C. to call for a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict, putting pressure on the Biden administration to act. In the world of U.S. politics, we're seeing the early signs of the 2024 showdown. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, both potential presidential candidates, will face off in a primary debate. And speaking of debates, a political action committee supporting DeSantis has released an attack ad against Haley, but its claims have been criticized as misleading. In other U.S. news, the United Auto Workers Union has ended a 6-week strike, securing commitments from Detroit's automakers to build new electric vehicles. Phoenix has successfully cleared a downtown homeless encampment, helping over 500 people find shelter. And Representative Jamal Bowman has emphasized the need to distinguish between the Israeli government and the Jewish people, calling for a ceasefire and accountability. Internationally, the U.S. is calling for Africa's African Growth and Opportunity Act to be more than just symbolic, and U.S. Representative Rashida Tlaib has accused President Biden of supporting a genocide against Palestinians. In legal news, a federal appeals court has temporarily lifted the gag order on former President Donald Trump, allowing judges more time to review his request for a longer pause on restrictions on his speech. Lastly, Biden's handling of conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza has exposed the difficulties of his foreign policy approach, as his support for Israel and India has been criticized for weakening democratic movements and human rights concerns. And there you have it, folks. A whirlwind tour of the latest headlines from around the world. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on these developments? Do you have any burning questions? Let's open the floor for discussion. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6 debrief via email.